Hey everyone, welcome to Base 10 Montessori. My name is Teresa, and today I'm going to go over Chapter 10 of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. So Chapter 10 is called Some Thoughts on Language. So we're getting into a big language section of the book, which is a really important part of Montessori. And language isn't just its own special area in Montessori, in the Montessori classroom. It is something that also exists beyond the language area in the Montessori classroom because language is in everything. And so it's one of those special sensitive periods that kind of can trickle over into the second plane of development. So it's going to be a very interesting chapter. Chapter 10 is kind of short, so this shouldn't be too long of a video, but then also chapter 11 will go into language a little bit more. So we've got 2 chapters coming up just on language alone. So to begin with, she starts on page 97 in my book, and she says some really profound things about language. She says, not only does it fuse men into groups and nations, but also it is the central point of difference between the human species and all others. Language lies at the root of that transformation of the environment that we call civilization. Without mutual comprehension with others, it is pretty clear that he, the human, would not be able to do very much. Language is an instrument of collective thought. The only thing that gives sense to these sounds is the fact that men have agreed to give them a particular meaning. And I really like this quote right here because we're at a time when we're trying to redefine words in our society, and we don't really agree on that, right? So when we say the word woman, for instance, certain groups of people have a definition of what a woman is, and then other groups of people have a different definition of what a woman is. So this is something that's, I think, a really particularly interesting thought going on right now, and I think our culture is really exemplifying the struggle that we're having. And she really brings it all into light by saying the only thing that gives sense to these sounds is the fact that men have agreed to give them a particular meaning. And I guess when you don't agree on the meaning, the sounds don't have as much sense, do they? So I think we're kind of seeing this idea of meaning and language and comprehension and mutual agreement. And she goes on to say words are expressions of agreement between the members of a human group. And only those in the know can understand them. Words are bonds between men, and the language they use develops and ramifies according to the needs of their minds. Language, we may say, grows with human thought. A curious thing to note is how few sounds are needed to make up so many words. And so I find all of these ideas here on page 97, how she starts this chapter to be a really profound view of society and how we are joined together by our language, not just what language we speak, but on how we agree upon words, about how we agree upon the communication that we're giving to one another. And so if you're looking at what's going on right now in society, you can also look at language as an indicator of what is going on in a particular group of people. So I find that to be a really important point that she's making right there. And then on page 98, she talks a little bit about the types of sounds. And anyone who is trained in phonics, trained in Orton Gillingham, or as a speech pathologist, you know that there are a lot of different types of sounds that we use in order to create language. And some of those sounds are voiced, unvoiced, spoken with the lips closed, or spoken with the lips open. All of those different types of sounds have allowed us to create a lot of vocal patterns and symbolize those vocal patterns. And it's really amazing how those few types of sounds can translate into so many symbols, and those symbols can translate into so many words. And then she says, but even more astonishing, even than that, is the power of memory to recollect so vast a quantity of combinations and their meanings. Thought has to be expressed by grouping words together into sentences. The words in these sentences have to be arranged in a particular order. Hence, language is truly the expression of a super intelligence. And then she goes on to emphasize that language is not given by nature. It's absorbed by the child during development. It is acquired. And if you've watched the other videos in the series, we've talked a lot about the language being a mental organ. We have the capacity for it, but it's something we have to develop. And if we don't develop it, if we're not exposed to language in that period of absorption, it does not develop. And that is also why children all over the world, no matter what language they're exposed to in that 0 to 6 age group, they will absorb it. On page 99, she says, language, however difficult we may find it, was at one time spoken by the uneducated classes in the land of its origin. And I didn't know the origin of Latin very much. I don't really know much about it. I didn't take Latin growing up, so this was new information for me when I read this. And she says, Latin, for example, which is hard even for those of us who speak one of its modern derivatives, was originally spoken by the slaves of Imperial Rome. Its complications then were just as great as they are now. And did not untaught laborers in the fields use the same language as 3-year-old children in the Roman palaces? So she's saying here that even something as complicated as Latin, if you are naturally exposed to it in the 0 to 6 age group as a child, you're going to absorb it just as proficiently as people who learn it in the highest socioeconomic status as you would at the lowest. This isn't something that takes a lot of learning at that age. Between the ages of 0 to 6, it takes absorption and being exposed to the language. So she goes on to explain that language develops naturally through absorption and follows fixed laws and universal stages of development, which is repeated for children all over the world, regardless of whether the language is simple or complex. And then on page 100, she says regarding sound, she said, sometimes the nose acts in unison with the throat. At others, the muscles of the tongue and of the cheeks have to be coordinated. Various parts of the body take part in the construction of this mechanism, which functions perfectly for the mother tongue, the tongue learned by the child, not by the adult, right? By the child. Yet, in a foreign country, we adults cannot even detect all the sounds we hear, far less reproduce them vocally. We can only use the machinery of our own language. No one but a child can construct his own machinery, and so learn to perfection as many languages as he hears spoken about him. This is not the result of conscious work. So she's saying here, remember when we talked about previously, the 0 to 3 age group is that unconscious learning, and the 3 to 6 is conscious learning right there, being conscious of what you're learning. And she says no child finds it tiring to learn his mother tongue. And I really find it interesting that she talks about how the child is constructing his own machinery for language. And when we're talking about that, I think about when I was in high school, we had exchange student from Japan, and the letter R was impossible for her to pronounce. And so when I'm thinking about the child is able to construct their own machinery, it really is true when we're going to a different country that there are just some reproductions of sound that as an adult, we really can't get the hang of, where a child can absorb it and reproduce it and become proficient in it. And so this really is true when we go to different countries and we experience different languages, right? We can learn and we can become maybe decent at it, right? Maybe pretty good, but rarely do we ever perfect it. And then on page 101, Montessori uses the development of a photograph as an analogy for language. So just to pause here real quick, before we talked a lot about the absorbent mind being a sponge, and how when the sponge is put into clean water, it absorbs clean water, but when it's put into dirty water, it'll absorb clean water and the dirt. So it's going to absorb both. It doesn't discriminate. And now she's going to also take the analogy of making a photograph. And this is another way to think about the absorbent mind, and that there's some room for it to do something with the information. And she says, the picture, like from a camera, she said, it becomes recorded on a sensitized plate, which can receive the image of 10 people just as readily as one. It all happens in a flash, and to take 1,000 people gives it no more trouble. She says the chemicals react to anything, simple or complex, in the fraction of a second. The image becomes imprinted in total darkness. It is fixed in the dark, and then only can it be shown in the open. But by that time, it has become unalterable. So I'm just going to go and explain this real quick if you didn't follow what she was saying here. So when you take a picture in a camera, and I realize that I'm probably speaking to people, some of the people out there only have used digital cameras, right? So we have to think back to film. Think back to film cameras. You had to have a dark room. So when you take a picture onto film, in order to develop that picture, it has to go onto a sensitized plate. And that process, just like with a printer, when I'm printing a picture of one person or 1,000 people, it's not going to make my printer work harder. Same thing when developing film. It's going to be the same process. So we can put more information in there or less. It's not going to be that much work. She said this all happens in a flash. So it doesn't matter how many people, how many objects we put in that picture. It can be developed just as easily as if there were one. And those chemicals react to anything, simple or complex, just like language, right? If we give it something simple, it'll react to something simple just as easily as something complex. And then she talks about that image becoming imprinted in total darkness. That's the unconscious mind she's talking about right there, not the conscious mind. The conscious mind is awake. This is total darkness. So again, all of this is happening with the unconscious mind, and it becomes fixed. And even though there's a little bit of adjustment when you, let's say, when you're developing film, or let's say even doing your software editing program for photography on digital cameras, there's some room to play, right? But back in the old days, when we developed film, once it was developed, once that picture was there, that's it. That's all you could do with it. That is the picture. There was a little bit of manipulation in that process in the darkroom, but it wouldn't change after that. And so that's what she's saying here, is that maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room for the child to do something with that information when it's being processed. But once it's solidified, once it's become imprinted, it can't change. And then she goes on to talk about what it's like to actually hand draw these pictures rather than taking a photograph of it. And she says, for us to draw a human figure takes time. And the more figures we draw, the longer it takes. And so that's really more like the work we have to put in after the age of 6 to learn something. It's like drawing a picture versus taking a photograph. And so it is going to take a lot more effort. So that's kind of what she's talking about right there when she starts talking about a photograph versus drawing a picture. And she says also about language, especially the very young child, she says, the quantity of inner work may be immense, yet the outer signs of it are often small. And if you have parents who are really worried about language development and making sure that their child is speaking and saying enough words at enough time, sometimes we have to remind them that there are going to be periods where the child is doing a lot of inner work, and you have to be patient. So we don't want to jump too much to the conclusion that a child is behind, especially in that 0 to 3 age group. We definitely will make a note of it if we're seeing that maybe they're a little delayed, but also just remember that there are going to be periods of inner work in the child. And those outer signs of language development are going to pull back just a little bit. And then she goes on to say, this means there is a great disproportion between the powers of expression and the inner work the child is doing. It is also found that the visible process does not go gradually, but in jumps. So if you're noticing this, if you have students, if you have children at home, that you kind of see these big explosions and then they kind of pull back and maybe they're a little bit more quiet, or maybe nothing's really happening for a little while. That, she says, is normal, because language isn't going to be a gradual thing. It's going to be jumps, leaps and bounds, right? These explosions are going to happen. So if you're noticing that in your child, Maria Montessori says that's normal. That's how development works, especially with language. And then on page 102, she says, the truth is that a continuous inner growth is taking place, which suddenly appears in a series of discoveries leading to rapid change. Then there follows another period of calm and slow development before the next vigorous outburst. These explosive happenings and eruptions in his powers of expression continue in the child well after the age of 2. Beyond this age of 2.5, which marks a borderline in man's mental formation, there begins a new period in the organization of language. So if you've listened to the other videos, you know that there's that unconscious period of development. That's the 0 to 3 age group. And then it becomes conscious around the age of 2.5 to 3. So that 3 to 6 is that conscious part of the first plane of development. And so that first part, that 0 to 3 age group, is that phase of creation, that unconscious creation. And then that 3 to 6 age group of the first plane is the conscious part, and it is the consolidation part where the child is consolidating all that he has created in the first 3 years. On page 103, she says, this second period lasts till somewhere about the 5th or 6th year. And during it, the child learns many new words and perfects his sentence formation. It is true that if the child's circumstances are such that he hears very few words or nothing but dialect, he will come to speak like this. But if he lives among cultured people with a wide vocabulary, he takes it all in equally well. So she says circumstances, therefore, are very important. So here we are having that discussion of nature versus nurture, right? We have the potentiality for language. It's a mental organ. We have the construct to acquire language, but then it switches over to nature, the responsibility of the external environment, and the circumstances are very important to that, especially in that 0 to 6 age group. And she says, this is the true perspective in which we must see the child. On his work stands civilization. This is why we must offer the child the help he needs and be at his service so that he does not have to walk alone. And that is pretty much the summation of chapter 10 right there. Now, there are always other things that go on in the chapter, so this is really just me picking out what I feel like is the most important parts of the chapter. But if you are interested in what she was saying there, go back, read the entire chapter, and make sure you get all the details of what she is saying there. But I hopefully this explains a little bit of her perspective on language, and we're going to dive deeper into language as we go through the next few weeks. So not only is chapter 11 also on language, but I'm about to start recording an entire language series. So that is also what I'm working on right now. And my language series that I'm going to be working on is it's going to be a deep dive into the theory of language development. And it's going to go beyond Montessori, because it's going to take my background in early childhood education. It's going to take my background in Orton Gillingham. It's going to take my background in Montessori. And it's also going to take the research that I did in grad school, and it's going to put all those things together, plus any of the research I've done since grad school. I'm trying to put it all together in one cohesive lecture. So it's kind of a big monster of a video, so I'm breaking it up into probably 4 parts. So as we're going through the language series or the language chapters here in the Absorbent Mind, I'm also going to be putting out my language series, so that you can get really this holistic view of language development that goes beyond just what Maria Montessori says in her books as well. But I feel like everything is very complementary to what she is saying. I don't see anything that is specifically contradicting anything she said. So it's mainly just taking what she says and going even further with it. So that's what's coming up. Hopefully you liked this. If you did, give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, and of course, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.